evening. Welcome to the final webinar in the Spring 2025 series presented by Newton Conservators. My name is Beth Wilkinson, and I will be the host of this virtual event. Barbara Bates is our technical director. As most of you know, Newton Conservators is an all-volunteer nonprofit established in 1961. We are grateful for the beauty and sustenance that the land provides for humans and the other creatures with whom we share this earth. Our goals of preserving open space and connecting people to nature require challenging the ways in which land conservation has historically excluded some peoples from protected land. Newton Conservators commits to acknowledging this exclusionary history and to building active partnerships with groups who have been hurt by that history, starting but not ending with Indigenous peoples such as the Massachusetts. As naturalist Aldo Leopold wrote, "When we see the land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." Tonight, Max Rome will discuss how Cheesecake Brook exemplifies the challenges facing urban streams. He will talk about the brook's history, condition, and current and future opportunities for restoration. Max is the Stormwater Program Manager at the Charles River Watershed Association. He completed his Ph.D. in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Northeastern University in 2022. His dissertation, From Water Quality to River Health, focused on understanding the connection between ecological restoration and improving water quality. We are really fortunate to have him educate us about Cheesecake Brook and brooks in general. Welcome, Max.
Thank you, Beth. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk about Cheesecake Brook. Tonight's talk is called Rediscovering and Revitalizing Cheesecake Brook. I grew up in North Cambridge, so kind of near the Charles River, and I remember coming across Cheesecake Brook as I kind of made my way up the river as a kid, but being at the Watershed Association over the last 3 years, a real highlight for me has been getting to know this very special tributary to the Charles. So here's a bit of the outline for tonight. I'm going to talk about, going to kind of give an introduction and a history of the brook. I'm going to talk about the current conditions, the challenges that the brook is facing, and urban stream syndrome, which is kind of a framework for understanding those challenges, and then the restoration efforts that are underway and being planned. And I've got about 30 slides, so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for conversation at the end of this. So the first thing I want to introduce is the Charles River Watershed and the Charles River Watershed Association. If you don't know us already, CRWA's mission is to protect, restore, and enhance the Charles River, and we've been at it since 1965, so before the Clean Water Act. The river itself is 80 miles long, winding its way all the way up through Milford and into Hopkinton, and the watershed is 308 square miles with over 1 million residents. So, an important thing for all of us to understand is if you care about the quality of a river, if you care about the quality of a brook, you really need to attend to every single drop of rain that can end up in that brook. And the watershed defines the area in which that rain is draining into the Charles River, or Cheesecake Brook. That's what we'll be talking about tonight. So a little bit about the brook. There it is within our watershed. Cheesecake is one of about 22 major tributaries into the Charles River. So the watershed is about 300 square miles, and Cheesecake Brook's sub-watershed is 3 square miles. The brook is about 3 miles long. It's entirely in Newton. There are 13 places that roads cross the brook where it passes into culverts or where it passes through bridges. And one of the things to us at the watershed that's really critical and important about Cheesecake Brook is it's the first daylit tributary above the Watertown Dam. So there's a lot of historic streams and brooks, Laundry Brook, Smelt Brook, Faneuil Brook, that are all completely buried, that have Stony Brook, that have just been 100% encased in masonry structures or now run to the Charles River through a pipe. And what you guys have in Newton is really precious because as altered as this brook has been, it's still breathing fresh air. It's still exposed to sunlight. It's still something that folks can stumble upon and start to understand how water moves through our landscape. So I think I just can't resist starting with a nice kind of thorough treatment of what we know about the development of Cheesecake Brook and where that name comes from. So kind of the definitive account of the name Cheesecake Brook comes from this 1889 King's Handbook of Newton. And the quotation in full is, "In the good old days of the colony, it received the name of Cheesecake Brook because a party of hunters rested at noonday on its sylvan shores and regaled themselves on cakes and cheese." And my understanding is that cakes in this context is a bit of an anachronism, and they may have been eating crackers. So they may have been having cheese and crackers on a picnic break while hunting along Cheesecake Brook. I'll say that there's some other there's another brook in Massachusetts called Cheese and Bread Brook. So we've got cheesecake, they've got cheese and bread. And this is, Cheesecake shows up on kind of the oldest maps that we have of Newton. This is, a really beautiful map where you can see the brook as it passes through John Fuller and Richard Parker's property. So, I think that the thing that we're going to kind of pay attention to here is the development patterns around the brook. In 1700, there were basically 3 or 4 major parcels that entirely contained the brook. This was rural land. This was agricultural land. By 1875, we're starting to see urbanization really happening within the watershed. So here's Newton. Red is the outline of the Cheesecake Brook subwatershed. And you can see kind of the modern branching form of Cheesecake Brook superimposed on this map. But the thing to really pay attention to here that I want to highlight is the Boston and Albany Railroad, which is basically where the Pike is now. But once this railroad was established, it really started to create urban development in this corridor that crosses Cheesecake Brook. And already by 1875, if you really zoom in on this map, you can see a couple places where the brook is underneath a bridge or underneath the railroad. By this time already, there would have been some stormwater infrastructure draining the city into the brook, draining different parts of the city street network into the brook. And this is, a famous map that we love to draw attention to when we're talking about Cheesecake Brook. This is Newton's areas requiring drainage map from 1892. And I'm an environmental engineer by training, and it's really interesting because if you go back and look at old environmental engineering textbooks, the profession was very, very focused on what are the most effective ways to drain wetlands. That was kind of the roots of this engineering discipline. And it's telling just that Newton commissioned a map and produced this really high quality map showing areas that needed drainage. Why did they need drainage? They needed drainage because as Newton was developing more intensive agriculture in certain places and especially more intensive residential development, all of a sudden having these large, wetlands, these areas that, got pretty wet and stayed wet for much of the spring, that had never been a problem before, but in 1892, we as a society were starting to see that as a problem that should be solved and could be solved. And I think another thing, I hope everybody has like a really giant monitor and can see this map as well as I can. But if you can't, I'll describe it. Another interesting thing to notice is how in the lower portion, I'm calling it the lower portion, but in the northern portion of Cheesecake Brook, where it starts to meet the Charles River, the area that's kind of now the Albemarle corridor, the brook was very, very unconstrained. It was still really connected to its floodplain. It was still really in, a large kind of marshy corridor. So that's 1892, those original parcels, the Fuller property, the Parker property, are still pretty open. There's not a modern street network in there in 1892. Between 1893 and 1917, we start to see really accelerating development especially along Albemarle Road. And this is, Newton Conservators and the Newton History Museum put together this really wonderful packet called A Walk Through Time Along Cheesecake Brook. And one of the things that they highlight is that Cheesecake Brook actually has a cameo in the Boston Metropolitan Parks Plan from 1893. And, the way that Cheesecake Brook is discussed is pretty interesting. At that time, the idea of creating a roadway around the brook was really seen actually as a way to preserve the brook. It was seen as a way to allow urban development, allow residential development to happen so that houses could be facing the brook and the brook would not be, kind of in their backyard. So I think, in a modern context, we would want to see a much larger kind of wetland corridor that would be established around the brook. But in 1893, having a roadway, kind of having a more formal edges of the brook was really seen as an innovation and a step towards preserving the brook. And, just another kind of historical touchstone here is, this is a historical image of the brook in the 19 teens and the 1920s. And then we know we have a date for when the really formal masonry channel walls were constructed, which was in 1937. And they were built by the Works Public Administration. And they have this wonderful progress bulletin that you can find online and read about all of the crazy projects that were happening in Massachusetts in the 1930s. But throughout our watershed and throughout our state, you will see a lot of these kind of masonry channels, and most of them were built by the WPA in the 1930s. We're working on another project in Milford that's very, the conditions of the brooks are very, very similar to Cheesecake. So, that's the historical perspective. A brook that was, a series of kind of interconnected wetlands and streams, ephemeral streams that kind of were a tapestry that changed and shifted through the season. Then waves of development, and then kind of a very formal, very constrained, channelized brook that was designed to get water out of the city as quickly as possible, really drain the city and create dry land around the brook. So, this is the image of the brook now. This to me is kind of like the classic section of Cheesecake Brook. You can see the masonry wall, which is, in slightly poor repair. You can see the mowed lawn. It's about a 25-foot bank on either side of the brook with, anywhere between a, 2 to 5 or 6 foot rise on it. And, the brook has this, this interesting thing that's happening to it right now, kind of thanks to the way the DPW is doing maintenance. They're actually kind of allowing a little bit of material to accumulate in the brook, and there is a little bit of habitat complexity that's introduced when some of the turf grass kind of sloughs off the top of the wall and then is colonized by an invasive, I believe this is reed canary grass that's growing really well in the brook and is providing a little bit of cover for frogs and other creatures to kind of find a home in what's otherwise a pretty fast moving brook without a lot of cover. So, a quick summary, what are we seeing in the brook? We're seeing hot temperatures, we're seeing flooding, we're seeing stormwater pollution, and we're seeing kind of degraded and absent riparian habitat. Brooks, rivers in the world and in our cities are corridors for wildlife. Even today, Cheesecake Brook functions as a corridor for wildlife. We know from talking to neighbors that they have seen foxes making their way up the brook. I've seen bullfrogs. There are still bullfrogs in the brook, but this kind of critical function of the brook as a corridor, as a sanctuary for wildlife within the city is not really functioning the way we should and can imagine it to function. And then, of course, climate change, heat, and changes in precipitation are really kind of exacerbating these threats. So a little bit about the land use in Cheesecake Brook. This image on the left is a little bit chaotic, but the main point is pretty much the whole watershed is dominated by residential development. About 15% of the watershed is open land. A huge amount of that is the Brayburn Golf Club, the Brayburn Country Club, which is in the headwaters of Cheesecake Brook. But between the Albemarle Field and the Fessenden School, there's also a little bit more open space. And then this image on the right is an image of where hydric soils are located. And hydric soils is just kind of a fancy way of saying wetland soils. So, this very pixelated image shows a little bit of what we understand just based on soils about where wetlands were located surrounding Cheesecake Brook. And you can see, especially that the area along Albemarle and into Fessenden was a location that, from these soils kind of clearly used to be a wetland. And you can also see kind of how wet and water retaining the Brayburn, the waters underneath the Brayburn Country Club are. So the really classic feature of urban development is that we have changed the way water moves through our landscape. And in the case of Cheesecake Brook, this brook is the watershed of the brook is about 40% paved, 40% impervious. So, 40% of the surfaces within this 3 square mile area are things that when water hits it, it doesn't soak into the ground, but it runs off. It runs off your roof it runs off your driveway, it runs off the sidewalks. And water that's hitting impervious surfaces is connected to the city's stormwater infrastructure, to the city's stormwater pipes. So everything that's in this watershed, in a kind of pristine state, all of the leaf litter, all of the organic material would have been decomposing, mostly in soils. Sometimes it would have been transported down a ways and accumulate in a wetland or a pond. Very little of it would be entering the brook itself. Today, the brook is kind of hyper connected to this watershed because those pipes make, I like to think of it as the pipes almost make the whole watershed an area that's bordering the brook. Water is so connected through those pipes. Material gets into the brook so quickly once it hits those pipes. So, this is, when we say 40% impervious, that's really an urbanized watershed. And on the right is a map showing what those pipes look like, what these different drainage areas look like. Every single one of these polygons is a different drainage area associated with its own unique outfall. And the color coding you can kind of think of as the intensity of pollution from each of these areas. And in Massachusetts, in the Charles River watershed, we're really paying attention to phosphorus. Phosphorus is a limiting nutrient in freshwater systems that's really kind of driving the growth of invasive species, and especially driving toxic algal blooms in the lower basin. So we know a lot about how land use and how the intensity of impervious area within our cities is related to phosphorus loading, and this figure kind of represents and encapsulates that information. This is another way of kind of telling the same story. The point here is that water is really entering Cheesecake Brook in two different ways. Some of it is coming as base flow. The brook is kind of cut into the city in a way that it's catching the groundwater table, and it's there is water that's moving into the brook from precipitation that's traveling slowly through the brook and entering it mostly through the ground. But a substantial amount of rain is entering the brook through these stormwater pipes. And in the upper section of the brook, there are at least 8 outfalls, which is kind of these black triangles, where the brook culverts, we aren't mapping all the connections, but there are even more stormwater connections into the brook during this kind of 1 mile underground journey that it takes between the McGrath Park and Watertown Street under the pike. And then in the northern section of the brook, where the brook flows towards the Charles River, there are over 40 stormwater outfalls. So there are over 40 places where pipes are carrying water right off the street, right into the brook, almost entirely untreated. And this is a picture of an outfall on the Albemarle corridor called this is called the Wildwood corridor that runs next to the Fessenden School. So why does this matter? Or what does this tell us? Why is this something that's worth paying attention to? One of the really kind of critical ideas in stream health is a concept called the impervious cover model. And what it says basically is there is a empirical relationship that we can see across the United States, where if you look at the health of an aquatic ecosystem, across many, many different metrics: water quality, what type of tiny creatures live at the bottom of the stream, what type of fish live in the stream. What you can see is this kind of decreasing relationship between the health and the integrity of the stream and the amount of impervious cover within its watershed. So in this zone between 25 and 60% impervious cover, streams tend not to support the type of aquatic life that should be in them. Above 60%, you're basically just talking about a drainage ditch. And in what does that mean in Newton? In general, Newton's about 37% impervious cover. And as we've talked about, Cheesecake Brook is higher than that. It's about 40%. And even a 1% increase in impervious cover increases the magnitude of floods by 3%. So there's a really kind of cumulative effect from all of that additional impervious area. I'm gonna hope these videos work, but what I'm gonna kind of point out now is, hope everybody can see this all right. This is what Cheesecake Brook looks like during base flow. It's a kind of stunningly beautiful urban stream. It's got really, really clear water. It's got a sandy substrate. Because there's so much flow through the brook, it's able to really move and process a lot of that organic debris. But when it rains, the brook looks very, very different. This is an image actually taken from beneath Craft Street that just shows kind of how turbid the water becomes, how quickly the water level rises. Cheesecake Brook is incredibly sensitive to the difference between base flow and wet weather flow. The entire character of the brook changes dramatically when it rains, and that's really, really a challenge for aquatic organisms. If you can hang while conditions are good, but you're just getting blown out by low dissolved oxygen, incredible turbidity, high flows when it rains, that's a major challenge. So the Charles River Watershed Association did a bunch of water quality testing in 2006 and 2007. And this is kind of, what these plots on the right show is, how some parameters change as you make your way down the brook from left to right is, from the headwaters out towards the Charles River. In this data, you can actually see the brook cooling to some extent as it picks up more flow and works where you work your way downstream. But another thing to point out is that the is E. coli. So E. coli is a indicator bacteria that we use to understand kind of the extent of bacterial contamination, potentially sewage contamination that's making its way into our waters. And in this data set on the right, what we see is that just downstream of the culvert, right where Cheesecake kind of daylights past Watertown Street, there's a major spike of bacterial contamination. So that's from 2006 and 2007. And then right now, CRWA is really engaged in doing some more frequent sampling. We were able to get out relatively frequently in last year, and continuing through this year. We've been able to take 18 samples, kind of mostly monthly samples, and 83% of these samples exceed the state standard for a Class B water body, which is what Cheesecake Brook is. So 83% of the time, Cheesecake Brook has more bacteria than we would like to see in the brook. So it's a problem, not just in wet weather, but also in dry weather. And of course, flooding, flooding is a major challenge. I would love to be out near Cheesecake Brook right now. It'd be really interesting to see. I imagine that it's kind of up above the channel walls, but still within the grassy channel. But it doesn't take a huge storm to cause flooding in the brook. And this is the output. I mean, from Cheesecake Brook, you know that people who live near there know that. You don't need a model to tell you that. But what we are seeing is that when we do model the brook, especially for the climate future, especially for what conditions are going to be like 50 years from today, there's substantial flooding. Portions of the brook that will be, greater than 3 feet higher than they are now, and, spilling out beyond the corridor. And there's a lot of, really important facilities in Newton that are potentially going to be impacted by that flooding. Another thing, just kind of for folks to understand is, the way the Clean Water Act works. The Clean Water Act 1972 says the waters of the United States, shall be made fishable and swimmable. That's the goal. Every single lake, stream, pond, waters of the U.S., they're supposed to be safe for swimming and fishing. We're not there yet, but that really is the goal. That's not kind of an environmental pipe dream. That's the entire kind of foundation of regulations in the United States. And the way that kind of gets promulgated, it is complex, but one of the things the Clean Water Act requires is that the state assess and maintain an updated list of how our waters are doing. And this is called the 303D list, the Massachusetts Integrated List of Waters. And under that list, Cheesecake Brook is listed as impaired for alterations in vegetative cover. So for kind of the lack of emergent vegetation and healthy vegetation that borders the brook. Anthropogenic substrate alterations, which means the bed of the brook has been really changed. There's excess algae. There's bacterial contamination. There's excess phosphorus, excess nutrients, which are flowing into the Charles River. And then the results of fish bioassessments, show that basically that there are not a lot of fish in Cheesecake Brook, and that's something that we're also really interested in understanding a bit further. So, we talked about this fish bioassessment. One of the key functions of tributaries is that they are not only are they distinct habitat, but they're also kind of a refuge for river fish. So river fish might access the tributaries for spawning. They might retreat into the tributaries during the summer when conditions get really warm in the main stem of the river, or when water levels get low. They might find refuge in the tributaries. We've talked about how this is the first trib above the Watertown Dam. Right now, kind of we're at the tail end of the spring herring run. And, the Charles River is a really important spawning ground for herring, which are an anadromous fish. They live in the ocean, but they have their babies in fresh water. And we know from volunteers and from people who are out kind of near the brook that herring have been trying to get up this slab, but have not been able to make it up this slab. So, this slab that's at the mouth of Cheesecake Brook, and it covers the MWA water or sewer line, is kind of an insurmountable obstacle for a lot of fish, separating, kind of walling off Cheesecake Brook from the rest of the river. So aquatic connectivity is a big deal, and reestablishing that connectivity is an important goal for the brook. Now I'm gonna talk kind of a little bit about the current restoration efforts. I'm gonna go a little bit quickly so that we can have time to talk at the end of this. But this is the current project that we're very excited to be involved with. We've talked about flooding. How do you solve flooding? One of the early proposals for solving flooding in this area was, hey, what if Albemarle could kind of become like a floodable wetland park? That idea is not compatible with the kind of recreational sports use that Newton needs. So what's the next idea? Well, what if we can start to retrofit our urban drainage system? What if instead of these pipes just shooting all this water out into the brook, we can start to reconnect the brook, reconnect the watershed back to the ground, so that more of that flow can come in as base flow, more of that flow can look clean like that first video I showed, and less of that flow is coming in all as a kind of dirty surge during storms. So part of this project is building about a 50,000 cubic foot subsurface infiltration chamber that's going to catch all of the runoff up to a 25-year storm from a 7-acre neighborhood above Craft Street. Part of this project is also catching a really big drain line that comes kind of from the FA Day School and stubbing it out so that we can do a similar project in the future, dealing with 25 to 50 acres of neighborhood. And then on the left, what you can see is mitigation planting area. So in this whole area, we're going to be able to replace those sloping turf walls with some really interesting, complex native vegetation that's going to provide habitat, going to provide forage for pollinators, and is going to do a lot to shade the brook and kind of improve conditions for both connectivity of animals that are making their way up this corridor and also kind of cooling the stream. A little bit more on this mitigation area. This is what it looks like now, and kind of one of the key and horrible features of this section of the brook is these asphalt channels that just take water right off of the street and dump them right in the brook. And we're going to be able to retrofit those channels with these things that are called storm turrets that kind of have filters built into them, and then they spread that rainwater through a restored native planting area. And the Charles River Watershed Association, to kind of toot our own horn a little bit, we've loved partnering with the city of Newton, but when this project started, there really were not significant restoration components in it. This stormwater mitigation piece was not a part of it. And we were able to partner with the city to apply for grant funding, first from the state coastal zone management to fund the engineering and design of the restoration system, of the bank restoration and the infiltration system. And then we were able to partner with the city to apply for Massachusetts vulnerability preparedness funding, $1.4 million to fund the implementation of the infiltration chamber. And much of the bank restoration. And as part of that, we were able to bring in actually, this is something that we did with our general funds. We were able to bring in a really skilled native plant and pollinator specialist who kind of took the landscape plan for the mitigation planting and really expanded it to focus on some plants that are, not present right now and are going to be really exciting to see in this stretch of Newton. So these projects are exciting. These projects are important. These projects are going to establish I think, a lot of momentum for the brook, but they're not going to solve the problem. To really solve the problem of the brook, we are going to have to, it's about retrofitting the way water flows from the watershed into the brook. It's a challenge that we're facing, throughout the whole Charles River watershed. And it's a challenge that we're, wonderfully starting to confront here in this one location. So, CRWA has been working really closely with Eric Hires, who's a wonderful environmental engineer that you have working for the city of Newton. And they have been very diligent looking for other locations where they can kind of follow the same game plan that we're doing with Craft Street and find other places where the city's stormwater network, passes by well-draining soils, and they can kind of divert those stormwater flows and get them into the ground so that water can flow through the soil, can get purified by the soil, can enter the brook over a period of days to even a week, which really evens out flow and corrects a lot of the issues with that impervious model kind of covers. So, that's one project that they're looking at McGrath. They're also looking at another really interesting project at the Davis Playground, which is kind of right where Cheesecake Brook first culverts. And, we've been really reaching out to the Brayburn Country Club, and they are also doing some really interesting work. Their Cheesecake Brook flows through their property, and what you see right here is a condition. This is not a healthy natural condition for a brook. You've got kind of mowed and fertilized lawn that goes right down to the brook. There's no vegetation that's emerging from the brook. The brook is not shaded, but they are undergoing this a National Audubon certification right now. And as part of that, they're looking at places where they can restore the wet meadow that would have been in this area, that would have, those hydric soils. That's kind of what would have been there. And they've done one project, and they're in the process of planning a second project. Yeah, and with that, I'd like to just kind of invite questions and comments. Here's a picture of me standing in the brook up above McGrath. But yeah, I thank you so much for your time, and this is such a special stream, and I love the chance to think about it and talk about it.
Thank you, Max. That was really amazing. You gave us so much good information. I love the fact that you took us from the history all the way up through what's being done now. It was interesting. Some comments came in from people who live near the brook, and it was fun to see their engagement, but it also, as you've indicated, affects all of us. So thank you. And it's so neat that it is the whole community coming together in many ways to work on it. Where to start? I want to go do the history, but first I want to ask you, why did you choose to focus on cheesecake? Was it serendipity that the city was working on Albemarle? Was it the fact that it's the first one down after the dam? What brought it to your attention?
Oh my God, such a good question. Thank you, Beth, for asking that. So, in my job, I'm like a kind of a stormwater guy. I'm really focused on how can we reduce pollution into the Charles River. But at the watershed, the way that we approach the river is we kind of have three different departments. One is stormwater, then one is climate uh, climate resilience. So really focused on how is, so I'm stormwater, which is water quality. I really care about the first inch of water that's entering the river and carrying all that pollution with it. Then the climate resilience is really focused on the next 8 inches of water that are causing flooding and are damaging property. Um, and and then our another department that we have, or another kind of program area that we have, is restoration. And restoration is really focused on where can we restore habitat, where can we restore aquatic connectivity, and of course the thing that we all care about is where can we do projects that are going to improve people's lives. So long story, long way of saying Cheesecake Brook is so special because it's like really a slam dunk. The opportunity to work on Cheesecake Brook, any project that we do can address habitat, stormwater pollution, and flooding. So, we really have limited resources, and we want to make the most use of them. And Cheesecake Brook is an incredible opportunity to do great work.
That is neat that all three come together. I want to go back to the history before we go more to talk about what's going on. And Alice says to us that she absolutely agrees that the main reason to map areas to be drained in the 1890s, Alice's specialty is history, um, was to make more land developable. But a secondary reason was actually fears about malaria associated correctly with the wetlands by that time. And she lists a report, which I will put. I always send out a letter. Those of you who are regulars know the next day I send out a letter with some information, and I will put her link in that. So that I thought that was an interesting point that she made. Also, you said that in starting in the 1800s, that the main focus was on drainage and getting the drainage away from the wetlands. At what point, if ever, did that focus stop? Or are we still in many ways in that stage?
Um, well, first of all, thank you, Alice. And I think Alice has shared with us a lot of really good information about cheesecake over the last couple of years. Um, but I think, we absolutely have exited that era. Um, I think I would take this in a little bit of a broader way, but when I think about the Charles River, especially, the river went through, some different eras. There was an era in which the river was used for its natural resources. There was kind of harvesting of fish. It was used for navigation. Then there was an era in which the river was really used for industry. It was dammed. It was used to kind of expel waste products. It was, powered different mills. And we are really in an era that's about restoration. I mean, that's really kind of like the modern, yeah, the modern era. Even the Army Corps of Engineers are, they're doing probably more dam removal projects right now than they're doing dam construction projects. And the environmental engineering profession, we're not, for the most part, touching a stream project that's not on some level about restoration. There's still a lot of projects that are about safety, but I do think that we've moved past that moment.
That's heartening. Thank you. So you talked to us about phosphorus and the harm it causes to invasive species and to algal blooms. Can you tell us what the source of that phosphorus is?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And you've got to bear with me on the answer here because basically phosphorus is in everything. It's especially in all living organisms and all organic material. Like if you remember your high school biology and you remember, ATP, that P is phosphorus. So it's a crucial way that living organisms store energy. And what that means is it's basically ubiquitous in our environment. So yes, there's phosphorus in motor oils, there's phosphorus in fertilizer, there's phosphorus in a bag of dog poop that someone left on the sidewalk. But there have been studies that have shown in urban areas as much as 40% of the phosphorus loading to a river could be from leaf litter.
Wow.
So yeah, the what I try and emphasize is that the issue with phosphorus is not that it's a pollutant, not that it's a toxic substance, but that it's something that in uh, the natural world is decomposing on land and is integrated into soil. But when we build these drainage networks, all of a sudden that organic material is decomposing, not on land, it's decomposing in the river, in our ponds, and fueling, instead of a terrestrial decomposition cycle, fungi, leaf litter, it's dissolving and it's fueling algal blooms.
Interesting. So the tanks that you were talking about putting in and the turrets, those drain into, they hold the water until it can all drain into the soil. So that takes care of the problem.
Exactly right. And it takes care of a lot of problems. I mean, it turns out soil has a huge capacity to absorb phosphorus. It bonds like really well with clays and silica. Um, so, when we build these infiltration systems, we are correcting that kind of broken hydrology. And not only are we purifying the water, as you say, taking the phosphorus out of it before it reaches the brook, but we're also cooling the water down because instead of being, absorbing all that heat off the road and shooting right into the brook on a summer day, it's passing through soils that, down in the water table are, 45 degrees maybe. And it's also slowing that water down. So instead of having these super peaky events after rainfall where the river goes all the way up and then goes all the way down and these long dry spells, we're evening that out. If that rain is let out over the period of days to weeks, that it does a lot for water temperature and it does a lot for maintaining stream flow during drought periods.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm going to go to a couple more questions. I'm sort of jumping around for those of you who put them in. We have a question. The map of the current renovation work at Albemarle Park seems to show that the work related to the brook stopping at Craft Street. What about the more northerly stretch of the brook closer to the river? Is new drainage, restoration, new plants, or rechanneling planned there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first of all, I just have to say we're really excited to announce that it's going to go all the way up to Craft Street. That just got approved by the Newton Conservation Commission just last week, I believe. So even that's an improvement from where we started. There are no plans to do that next section yet, but absolutely we're gonna, just speaking from CRWA, absolutely we're gonna figure out how to do it. And I think the hope is that this project can be really successful. We can learn from it. We can see what works, maybe see what didn't work, and that can really help to inform the next step. I should just say it's not in this presentation, but there is a more ambitious vision of what the river bank restoration could look like. Thinking about getting rid of those masonry walls, thinking about how to kind of create space for wetlands and overtopping banks that are kind of more connected to the stream corridor, and that's something that we also kind of hope to explore.
Something in between the open wetland that would cover all of Albemarle and
Yes.
the current situation.
Yes.
Okay, that probably has a good chance, a better chance. Elizabeth, who says hello to you, says that her son Felix is wondering what kinds of animals would gain back habitat with the restoration.
Oh my God. Good question, Felix. So, so many creatures, but to name a couple, the American eel is one of my favorite creatures, and there are kind of studies that show, pre-development, 25-30% of all of the mass of all the living mass in all of these brooks and creeks was American eels. And so we hope that they would be able to find their way back into the creek. With improving water quality, there could be larvae of dragonflies and mayflies. There's a lot of it's not like we don't think that there's going to be, brook trout in Cheesecake Brook, but there could be, creek chub and, different native minnows that would love to find a space to live there. And then the one that would be very exciting to see would be to see the alewife migration make its way up into Cheesecake Brook and to see them find a place to, they do like to lay their eggs on rocky stuff, and some of them do like to lay them in fast moving water, is my understanding. So that would be really special.
So what do you do about the slab to make all of that happen?
I think that's got to be one of the next projects that we tackle together. And there's a lot of modern solutions for how to leave that slab in place, but create, a rock vein on top of it that would kind of act as a fish ladder and maintain an area with deeper water and continuous flow, even when water levels are low. I think it's something that could be a really interesting project. There's an opportunity for it to be kind of artistic, to kind of play with the sound of that water running over the slab. So I we hope to pursue that in the coming years, and we would really, really welcome community engagement and support and creativity around kind of how to make that happen.
So how do you do that? How do you make the water basically go uphill?
Yeah, fortunately the water's going going downhill, but it's about, as it's flowing across that, down that slab. Um, Yeah, as it's flowing down that slab right now, it hits kind of a toe and then it drops into an area that's kind of scoured out. And it's about making sure that as that water flows down that slab, instead of just spreading all the way across that, 20-foot slab and being, a quarter of an inch thick, we're creating kind of a contoured path that's deeper that a fish can make its way up. Yeah, I mean, and so the challenge here really is not the engineering. The challenge is really going to be getting MWRA, DCR, and the city of Newton all to the table, and accepting kind of a plan that could advance this. It's nobody's number one priority. DCR's got a lot on their plate. MWRA has a lot on their plate. The city of Newton is working really hard to meet their stormwater pollution reduction requirements, but that's kind of what the Watershed Association does. That's kind of our job to take a project like this and figure out how to make it happen, how to work with the state to find funding to do something like this.
That's terrific. We have a question about a fish ladder. So it sounds like your idea would not incorporate a fish ladder per se.
Yeah, you could think of it. I think I wouldn't, I'm not really thinking of it as a fish ladder, but you can think of it as you can definitely think of it as a fish ladder. Basically creating a fish ladder or changing the slab so the whole slab is a little bit like a fish ladder. That's the idea.
Okay. And we have a couple questions about how this would connect to the dam, the Watertown Dam, coming out or not coming out.
Yeah, so this the brook itself is, we've done modeling on the removal of the dam, and the brook is above the area that would be influenced by the dam removal. So in terms of the elevation of the water. So it's not going to be, affected by the dam removal in that way, but fish passage is going to really change once that dam is removed. Once that dam is removed, there's going to be many, many more herring, shad, eel that are making their way up the river, and would be interested in finding their way into Cheesecake Brook.
And we can continue to hear about that from you. I presume your website is a place we all can go to. We can send out that information tomorrow. And so we can find out as that proceeds. And we also, part two, is what we can do to help. And we have questions about two phases of that. What individual people living near the brook can do, how they can help, and two, what everyone can do with our elected officials to advocate.
Yeah, excellent questions. So part one, what can you do on your own property? We talked about how water is getting into the brook too quickly, how it's coming off of impervious surfaces, and that's the impervious problem. If you on your property can build a rain garden, can install rain barrels, if you can catch the first inch of rain that's coming off of your roof and driveway and keep that on your property and let that soak into the ground, you are recreating the natural hydrology of your property. That first inch of rain is super, super duper critical. So, it's a small thing, but if everybody did it, it would really make a difference. And then collectively, what can we do? There's so much that we can do. And CRWA, please look at our website. We have an advocacy center, which is related to different state bills that we're advancing that are going to give more funding for programs like the MVP program that are going to establish better state level flood planning and collaboration. And then, in the city of Newton, in the Charles River Watershed, we've just advanced recommendations for improved local stormwater regulations. So Newton actually has very good stormwater regulations, but they're not the best in our watershed. There are towns that are starting to go really far beyond the state requirements, and both Watertown and Waltham, for instance, require that any project greater than 5,000 square feet has to retain the full 100-year storm and infiltrate that full 100-year storm on their property without dumping into the city's storm sewer system. So we're in talks with Newton city councilors and their DPW staff about, why we really think that this could be a cost-saving regulation to implement. So there's so many opportunities for advocacy.
That's terrific. And so what percentage, if we all on our properties, whether it's near the brook or anywhere in the city, manage to take the first inch, how many storms are bigger than that by and large?
That's a great question. The way I liked the answer is in Massachusetts in an average year, there are about 48 inches of rain that fall in an average year. And of that rain, of those storms, 67% of them are less than 1 inch. And then the storms that are bigger than 1 inch, even if they're an inch and a half, that first inch was less than 1 inch. So what we know is that depending on what types of soils you have, you are reducing pollution by between 90 and 99% if you're able to capture the first inch of rain.
That is terrific. We have one question. Would repaving a driveway with pervious paving help the brook?
Absolutely. 100%. And there's better and worse ways to do it. Putting in gravel is not great, but there are a couple things that I'd recommend very quickly is the trench drains, if you maintain them and if they flow to a rain garden. That's a really good way to do it. Another thing is, there's this stuff called structural turf that you can look into, or these, you'll kind of sometimes see these kind of X pattern paving stones that have grass growing up in between them. So, not all pervious surfaces are created equally, but that's a wonderful way to keep pollution and keep polluted flows out of the brooks.
If people want to learn more about that, do you have a source to recommend?
The kind of key term is depaving, and there's a number of really wonderful resources. We work with Green and Open Somerville that actually run a community depaving initiative where they come out and they bring crowbars and sledgehammers and wheelbarrows, and they help community members take up their driveways. And then they have a couple great presentations that show kind of before and after pictures of all sorts of different types of driveway alternatives.
They've come to an Earth Day event and a couple other events
Oh,
here.
great.
They are terrific. Maybe we'll have them come talk to us one day.
Yes, or maybe someone in this room wants to be the first Newton depaving, and we could help to make that happen.
Okay, that's exciting. That's really neat. We have a question from one of our city councilors saying, can you build this kind of infiltration system in an area where there is a high groundwater table?
Yeah, so, state regulations kind of require a certain depth between the infiltration system and the groundwater table, usually about 2 feet. It's important that you don't raise the groundwater table. But that being said, there are a lot of creative ways to do it. You can build very shallow systems. So I think my short answer is that it's often possible in locations in which you might think it would be suboptimal, but it can still be possible.
Great. We're running out of time. Got to pick a couple last questions. One of them is when you were talking about the vegetation that was going to be put in along the banks, you mentioned shade, and one of our attendees would like to know, why is shade desirable?
Yeah, really important. Massachusetts has this wonderful framework for understanding the impacts of climate change. And in our region, one of the things they really highlight is that the greatest threat to aquatic health in the next 50 years is actually going to be extreme heat. We could do, we could do great work in Cheesecake Brook, but if that water is 85 degrees in the summertime, it's just not going to support healthy life. So what we talked about, moving flows from wet weather flows to dry weather flows to base flow, is really important, but it's also important to shade the brook. That's very basic, but very valuable, it turns out, for these little streams.
And does the turbidity that comes after a rainstorm, is that because of sediment that comes along with the water? Is it because of the algal bloom that comes? What causes that turbidity?
Yeah, that's sediment. It's just all the junk that's washing off of the city streets. And it flushes out of the brook. The algae is not growing that quickly, but it flushes out of that brook. It enters the Charles River, and that sediment, those particles are carrying with them phosphorus. And as that organic material settles and decomposes and dissolves, that's what fuels the blooms that you really see in the lower basin, down by the Longfellow Bridge between Boston and Cambridge.
Okay, and we have, this will be our last question. How does the Cheesecake situation compare to Fuller Brook, which is in Wellesley, for those who might not know?
Yeah, another wonderful question. Fuller Brook was also kind of channelized by the work public administration, and is I think of it as like a sister brook to Cheesecake. but there has been incredible restoration done in Fuller Brook, and we actually run tours out there. And I think we will do another one coming up. Actually, this year we are doing an event that we call A Tale of Two Brooks, and it's a bio blitz first at Fuller Brook and then at Cheesecake Brook, so that people can get out at both of these sites and start counting the diversity of plant species, maybe start counting the diversity of insects, and see just how starkly different the conditions are at two, arguably similar brooks. There is a little bit more there, development encroaches a little bit more on Cheesecake Brook than it does on Fuller Brook, but they're very, very similar. And I think Fuller is a great example of what could be achieved at Cheesecake.
Although it has a wider area.
It does have a wider area. Yeah.
And John Regeson of Newton Conservators is helping with the BioBlitz, or is overseeing the BioBlitz for Cheesecake.
Yes, we're really looking forward to that collaboration together.
That is terrific. Well, thank you so much, Max. This was wonderful. Clearly, we have people energized to do more, to help more politically. We'll send them to your website. And as Susan says, that she's reiterating and making sure that we should all do the depaving or catching the runoff. And so we all have a lot to do to help you in our small way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight and inviting me here.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. This was terrific. Good night.